Columbus the Idiot, Part 2. Lies, Murder, Rape, and Syphilis. A true American hero. Welcome to History Uncensored, where I don't give a fuck what you learned in history class. I really don't. And this is Part 2 of Columbus. And I really recommend going back and listening to Episode 1 because it's awesome. Listen close today. Shit is about to get real. If you find this interesting, share this motherfucker on social media, will ya, okay? It would mean the world to me. Also subscribe. I bet my wife I could get 50 subscribers by the end of July. Right now, I am horribly losing that battle. And she is so smug. As a reminder, I'm Seth Michaels, and we are going to be talking about Columbus, and I wanted to start with a funny story before all of the terrible stuff starts happening. At least I thought the story was funny. Kind of. In 1974, Indians claim Italy by right of discovery. Yeah, you heard that right. You know, the Italy that we think and remember as the cradle of Western civilization. They woke up in 1974 to realize that they had never been discovered. You might be thinking, Seth, you twat, haven't people been living in Italy for like thousands of years? Oh, that's most assuredly right, astute listener. But at 11 o'clock, September 24th, 1974, chief of the American Indian tribe of the Chippewas stepped off his plane in full garb and claimed possession of Italy by right of discovery. Granted, he didn't have ill will in mind, or he didn't harbor murderous thoughts. The Chippewa chief was just making a point. What right had Columbus to discover America when it was already inhabited for thousands of years? He said, the same right that I have to come now to Italy and claim to have discovered your country. He's a pretty smart guy. But that's kind of what we remember in history books. Columbus sailed his 3 little caravels. They set sail and they discovered a place where people were already living. Maybe you can try that on your boss's position. Like, I really don't I know you've been in the position a while, but I really don't think it belongs to you. I claim your position by right of discovery, and then start looking for another job. Let's talk about history. It's hard to think that or remember that textbooks don't always tell the truth. Like I said, I don't give a fuck what you learned in them. Either by omission or outright lies, we're subjected as readers and students to the opinions of the authors on whatever subject we are reading. We're also subject to whatever biased knowledge they use as the base for their study. As kind of a third lens, as humans, it's difficult to picture viewpoints of those not immediately involved in an experience. Generally, we just see the two opposing views. We don't always see the future ramifications or the often confusing lead up to the altercation. Another thing that we miss is how the actions of a few can affect the many. In studying Columbus, if you've ever studied Columbus, how many of you thought about Africans and the impact it had on their society and their future African American ancestors? No, we don't think about that. We think about the effect they had on the islands that they landed on and the effect it had back home, but we very rarely see the tertiary effects or think about the tertiary effects in history. Give that a little bit of thought, what I might mean by that. Because we're going to get down to the history of genocide, lies, rape, exploitation, and to do that, we need to step back into Columbus's world in 1492 and continue on the path we started during the last episode. The discovery by chuckle-headed Columbus. By the way, chucklehead would have been like an old world insult in the time. I just think that's funny. It means idiot. So next time you see somebody that you don't like, call them a chucklehead for me. How many of you think you know that story? Think you know the story after Columbus? After, right? We know it, or do we? Let's go back and do a little bit of an overview from the previous podcast if you're a lazy bastard and you don't want to go back and listen to it. All right. April 17th, 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella, those Catholic monarchs of Spain, or Castile at the time, they signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, and I talked about this in the last one. This is that agreement that they had between Christopher Columbus and them. And Columbus, as a reminder, was a wool-weaving apprentice of Savona. He undertook a voyage of discovery in the Atlantic. He was only about 41 years old, maybe older. Remember, his birthday's confusing. Well, he gave up his father's business. He spent 9 years in Portugal doing God knows what. We only really know that he was a petty trader, and he may or may not have made some maps with his brother, Bartholomew. During this period, we do know he married an aristocratic young woman, and she had him a son, Diego. We all remember Diego. We love him. He only commits a few atrocities later on, not nearly as many as his father. During this time, he also may or may not have made some sea voyages to kind of in an unidentified capacity, but sometime in those years, he convinced his dumbass self of the enterprise of discovery. Remember, he didn't find acceptance in Portugal. The king was like, "You're an idiot. Get out of here. You may or may not have also stolen things, so there's a warrant for your arrest." He came to Spain in 1485-ish, left his son in a monastery, tried to schmooze in with the monarchs and aristocracy, but he lived pretty poor, peddler of books and maps, and he basically lived on the handouts from noble patrons who kind of might have liked him. Interesting, I don't know if this is ever really talked about, but the only people that really liked him and wanted to generate and push this idea of discovery in new lands were people, they were conversos. So what that means is that they converted from Judaism to Catholicism at some point, very smartly, because, Spanish Inquisition, murder, and all of that. But they converted, and they really wanted to push this right of discovery through, and they helped fund Columbus and all of that stuff. And also remember that he may or may not have known, probably did, at least in my estimation, that the islands existed before he went on his trip. But we're back in 1492 in April, and they just signed these capitulations, this contract. What did it say? It said Columbus was to be an admiral of all those islands and mainland in the ocean, which by his hand and industry he would discover and acquire. And remember, that's what got him in trouble. The title to be hereditary, and the office to be equal in preeminences and prerogatives to that of the High Admiral of Castile. Number 2, he would be Viceroy and Governor General of all the said islands and mainland. In a provision signed a few days later, Columbus was specifically granted the power of Admiral, Viceroy, and Governor, and to hear and dispatch all civil and criminal proceedings pertaining to said office of Admiralty and governorship and such. And this is where things started getting to his head. Punish and castigate the delinquents. We'll find more about that later. For his personal gain, just a small portion, he was to have 10% of all the removable assets of the newly discovered lands, including gold, silver, pearls, and precious stones, He was also supposed to have 10% of the trade they're in and basically create a monopoly under his control. And he was to receive an additional 12.5% in return for his pledge to contribute an eighth part of the cost of the expedition. Funny thing about that is he really didn't contribute 8% to the expedition. He borrowed the money from some other people who contributed. All those conversos that I was talking about, specifically Lord Senegal. He's like, yeah, here's some money. Take it. But he didn't really have any money because he was poor and stupid. But all of those things kind of paled in comparison and significance to the tragic portent where the provisions of the agreement that gave a weaver's apprentice and petty sailor the absolute power of life and death over tens of thousands of innocent human beings. And it was his incapacity to discharge that responsibility justly and humanely that would be distressingly demonstrated in the years that were to come. Before his return to Spain, so he went there and then he was coming back. They had to have proof that they acquired the lands, and Columbus made the decision to leave behind men of the Santa Maria on Hispaniola. And this was to establish a colony. The men on that ship seemed to be uniquely qualified for doing so. You might remember a story that the Santa Maria ran aground just off of the shore. You know, I don't know if it was an accident. My gut tells me that it was probably on purpose. Like I said, that ship and that crew in particular was uniquely set up to live as a settlement, and part of the capitulations was they needed to acquire the lands. The only way to acquire them was to have people there. And further proof that Columbus was an idiot if he still thought they were in the Indies. Reports from the era don't match at all the living situations for the people that they found on the islands. They weren't rich, they weren't powerful, but they were serviceable. Now we're going to kind of go through a list of his wrongdoings and idiocy. And first on that list is murder. And you might, again, remember some of this from the previous episode where I kind of went over it very briefly. Chilling omen of fate of the unarmed and inoffensive Arawaks is indicated in Columbus's journal under date of October 14th, 1492. 2 days after the first landing of the expedition on the tiny island of Guanahani in the outer Bahamas, which Columbus christened San Salvador. When your highness so command, they could all be carried off to Castile or be held captive in the island itself, he wrote, because with 50 men they could all be subjugated and compelled to do anything one wishes. On Sunday, November 11th, a month after the historic landing, the fleet of Discovery was anchored in a harbor along a coast that seemed without limit. The admiral, the idiot, the chucklehead, he understood the name of this island to be Colba. He tentatively identified it as the fabled island of Kipango, or Japan. He's like, yep, this is it. This is Japan, or it's the mainland. Because remember, he had no idea how big the Earth was, so he's like, yeah, I definitely sailed halfway across the globe to here. Not just a hop, skip, and a jump. The fleet had reached Colba October 28th and now lay at the mouth of a large river that Columbus named Rio de Mares. 4 weeks of rather aimless wandering among the islands surrounding that area had turned up very little in the way of gold, and that must have pissed him off. Because if there's a few things that Columbus likes more than God, murder and adultery. It's gold. He was pretty concerned. Only a few of the natives wore small articles of gold, and they traded them pretty readily for any trifles the Christians offered them. But where had that gold come from? Those damn artless and naked islanders were eager to please, but the difficulty of communication was great. The sign language Columbus and his company tried to use was awkward and easily misunderstood, and did little to identify the source of the gold. That gold just meant so little to the wearers and so much to these odd and powerful beings they believed had come from the sky. I doubt they believed they came from the sky. For fuck's sake, they were riding in boats. They came from the sea. That's just not true. In his frustration, Columbus turned his attention to the trees and shrubs, because he couldn't find any gold. He's like, these trees and shrubs must be of value. He was certain of it. What trees and what spices and shrubs? And he had no idea. And though I believe there are many herbs and many trees that would be highly valued in Spain for dyes or medicinal spices, most of them I don't recognize, which causes me great annoyance. By October 19th. One of the herbs he failed to recognize was to engender more wealth after Columbus's death than he could possibly have dreamed. Granted, he wasn't going to get any of it. But during his, little trip up the coast of Cuba, he sent 2 men to the interior of the island, and they returned to the ship to report on what they had found. Among other things, they related that many of the natives, both men and women, were accustomed to holding a firebrand of weeds in their hands and inhaling the smoke. The journal doesn't identify Yarbas, but Father Las Casas, that, good old historian that we'll refer to, he does in his Historia, which is Columbus's biography. Columbus had incidentally discovered tobacco. And again, I say discovered loosely. He discovered it for Europe, because obviously if the natives were smoking it, it was already discovered. And to the end of his life, he was completely unaware of the impact that discovery was going to make on the world's economy. And if you add that to, the amount of deaths this world, he somehow managed to create, it's staggering. But I won't, because life's easier that way and I'm lazy. Well, so far Columbus had little more tangible to offer, his monarchs than the beautiful scenery he described in his journal day after day in endless detail. And his journal's free to read online, so you can look that up. The Historia by Las Casas and his diario. Look it up, read it. It's pretty boring. He's a bad writer. He was aware, though, that scenery couldn't be cashed in at the bank. And the prospect of another source of revenue was plainly visible and plainly abundant began to take shape in his mind. Along with the scenery, Columbus never tired of extolling the docility and peaceful nature of these timid people, who had welcomed him and his fellow voyagers with awe and affection to their Eden-like island. He kept turning over in his mind how the meek and artless character of these brown-skinned hosts could be made a source of profit. On the same day that the expedition landed on Guanahani, Columbus noted that the natives should make good servants. A few weeks later, he remarked in his journal, "They are very meek and without knowledge of evil, nor do they kill others or steal. And they're without weapons, and so timid that one of our people can put 100 of them to flight." On December 3rd, this is a month and a half in, a little bit over that, the admiral writes, and he assures his sovereigns that 10 men could cause 10,000 of the natives to flee. So cowardly and faint-hearted are they, and they carry no arms except some rods at the end of which are pointed sticks, which are fire-hardened. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Remember how I said murder? So he's really, in his mind, he's thinking about it. Basically, from when he lands, he's thinking about murdering and capturing these people. Well, he came back and he didn't have much to show for it. I'll get into a little bit about what he came back with when I get into the next topic. But let's talk about the second voyage and cannibals. What does that word instill in your mind? Cannibal. Ooh. Donner party, maybe. Maybe you think of a backward jungle-type person chewing on the flesh of their enemies. On the outward passage of the second voyage, Columbus had a fleet of 17, and with that fleet, he's discovered a bunch of other islands in the Caribbean. Some of these islands were inhabited by a warlike people, very unlike the Arawaks, and he called them Caribs. They had the reputation, whether deserved or not, of dining on the prisoners they took in raids on their peaceful Arawak neighbors to the north. Tisk, tisk, tisk. They fought these guys. There was a brief skirmish with the cannibals on the island of St. Croix, one of those Virgin Islands. A Spaniard was killed by an arrow, and a few of the natives were taken prisoner. We're not really sure the exact number. It's hard to establish. There were a few different eyewitness accounts, and they were rather confusing. It couldn't have been more than a dozen or so that were taken, including 3 or 4 male adults and some women and children. But this was the catalyst. They were enough to give Columbus an inspiration for carrying on his proposed traffic in slaves without hindrance from his sentimental sovereigns. We'll just call his merchandise cannibals, and who could object? Who cared what happened to cannibals? But Columbus went from an idiot to a bad man with a mean streak. An ingenious plan occurred to Columbus for imposing profitable servitude on the entire native population. He decreed that every Indian over 14 years of age inhabiting the 2 large areas of the island, Hispaniola, where some gold had been found along the riverbeds, they must pay tribute every 3 months. How much? They must fill a hawk's bell. Look it up if you don't know what it is. Well, not everybody could get gold. And what was the punishment? Well, some of those living a distance from the sources of gold, they'd be allowed to substitute about 25 pounds of cotton. Here's what he did to ensure compliance with the order. Columbus devised a metal disc to be hung around the neck of each native, showing whether he was up to date with the tribute, branding them. Those in arrears were punished. Any who rebelled or tried to flee were hunted down and sold into slavery, or murdered. I think Washington Irving, even though he wasn't always the best historian, writes this quite nicely. In this way was the yoke of servitude fixed upon the island and its thraldom effectually ensured. Deep despair now fell on the natives when they found a perpetual task inflicted upon them. Weak and indolent by nature, unused to the labor of any kind, and brought up in the untasked idleness of their soft climate and their fruitful groves, death itself seemed preferable to a life of toil and anxiety. And they literally did that. They killed themselves by the thousands. They killed themselves instead of work for Columbus. Work to get him gold, work to get him cotton. What's super shitty about the cotton is that it wasn't of commercial use. It wasn't as good as the cotton already being produced elsewhere. So it was pretty much unusable. So he was murdering people for no reason. One of the other ways the law was enforced, if you were unable to bring the arrears, if you were unable to bring your cotton or your hawksbill of gold, and you were over the age of 14 years old, he cut your fucking hands off. Now, there are a lot of arteries and blood flowing and pressure built up through the hands of the body. The blood spray must have been immaculate. And I'm pretty positive that several people died because of this. It's just, some of them you just wouldn't have been able to stop the bleeding, or there wouldn't have been people around to stop the bleeding of it. These people, these docile Arawaks, they saw no end to the harassing evil which had so suddenly fallen upon them. No prospect of a return to the roving independence and ample leisure so dear to those inhabitants of the forest. The pleasant life of the island was at an end. They were now obliged to grope day by day, with bending body and anxious eye along the borders of their rivers, sifting the sands for the grains of gold, which every day grew more scanty, or to the labor in the fields beneath the fervor of a tropical sun to raise food for their taskmasters, or to produce the vegetable tribute imposed on them. They often sunk sleep-weary and exhausted at night, with the certainty that the next day was to be a repetition of the same toil and suffering. By his own authority, Christopher Columbus. Well, after that pleasant discussion, let's take a brain break, and I want you to think about other areas of history that you would like me to cover. I will be getting back in the next episode to slavery, and we'll be going through Greece, but think of very broad topics that also affect today or have left a legacy on today's society. I want to know them. Also, any women in history that you would like me to cover, shoot me an email. contact@historyuncensoredpod.com, and perhaps I'll throw you a mention on the podcast. But other than that, for the moment, take your brain break, and I'm going to give my voice a break. Welcome back. This time, we're going to be going over part 2 of part 2. That doesn't make any sense. We're going to be going over slavery and Columbus and how much of an asshole he was. Such an asshole. Let's get into it. By December 16th, 1492, we're going back to 1492 now. We just left the second trip. We're back at the first trip. 1492, December 16th. His ideas in slavery, in that respect, have really started to take a definite form. They had no weapons and are all naked without any skill in arms and are very cowardly, so that 1,000 would not challenge 3, says the journal for that date. Thus, they are useful to be commanded and to be made to labor and sow and to do everything else of which there is a need, and build towns and be taught to wear clothes and learn our customs. We saw that in the murdering things, definitely the made to do labor, so on and so forth. Taught to wear clothes and learn our customs. I guess part of the goal that the monarchs wanted was to bring Christianity to the people, even if they didn't want it or cared about it. In a famous letter to Louis de Senegal, his patron at court, the one I've talked about, he gets right down to business. In conclusion, to speak only of what has been accomplished on this voyage, which was so hurried, their highnesses may see that I can give them as much gold as they will need, with very little aid from their highnesses. And there are spiceries and cotton, as much as their highness may order, and mastic in whatever quantity they may order, and slaves in any number that they may order, and they shall be of idolaters, heathens. Great evils are apt to have small beginnings. Or, as Father Lacasas put it, men are never accustomed to falling into a single error or committing only one sin. And before that, Columbus had already decided to take some people. November 11th, 1492. The admiral ordered 5 young male natives who had come trustingly aboard his flagship. He ordered them forcibly seized to take to the sovereigns to learn our language so that it might be disclosed what is in the land. Side fucking note. That didn't sound like such an important passage or such an important thing to say, or something that would have such dire consequences on the future. But that heinous act right there, that act of taking those men and the several women that he took so to keep those natives happy and them, that act was the very beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. He took them forcibly. He's like, yep, you're coming aboard my ship and I'm gonna give you to the monarch so you can learn our language. But still, they weren't given an option. Hot Catholic spice trade. This is an important moment. And remember, the transatlantic slave trade was a more than 12 million persons trade. It lasted more than 400 years. That moment. And I'll definitely be going over the transatlantic slave trade in my slavery series. But I just want everybody to take a moment and think about that. To Columbus, it was nothing. And really, to him, it was just to find gold. But that one moment imprinted in his mind how easy, profitable that slaves could be. And that moment changed the world forever. It changed this continent forever. It changed the Western Hemisphere forever. Well, the Catholic sovereigns must have taken more than a passing note of their admiral's burgeoning ideas for the exploitation of the natives. In written instructions to Columbus, written in May of 1493, the king and queen were explicit in their mandate respecting treatment of the Indians. Remember, this was after he had already taken some back. Not only was Columbus to make their conversion to the Christian faith his first order of business, but the monarchs also firmly decreed that they were not to be molested or coerced in any way. The said admiral shall take measures that all those who go therein, and those who have gone before from here, shall treat the Indians very well and affectionately, without causing them any annoyance whatsoever. And at the same time, the admiral shall make some gifts to them in a gracious manner, and hold them in great honor, and if it happens that some persons should treat the Indians badly in any way whatsoever, the said admiral, as viceroy and governor for their highnesses, shall mete out severe punishment. That was before the second voyage. I think you remember from just a few minutes ago me talking about said voyage. Let's get back to it. Right after the cannibals. And remember, he had captured some of them already. Maybe 12, maybe less, maybe more. He'd given one of his crewmates a lengthy memorandum instructing him as how he was to explain the shipment of slaves to their highnesses. And it laid the groundwork for more of the same. Quote, "You must say and supplicate on my behalf to the king and queen, our lords, the following. Say to their highnesses that because there is no language by means of which these people can understand our holy faith, thus are being sent with these ships the cannibals, men and women and boys and girls, which their highnesses may order placed in the possession of persons from whom they can best learn the language. Say to their highnesses that the profit from the souls of the said cannibals would suggest the consideration that many more from here would be better, and their highnesses would lie served in this manner. That in view of the need for cattle and beasts of burden for sustaining the people who are here, their highnesses could give license to a number of caravels sufficient to come here each year and bring the said cattle and other provision, for which payment would be made in slaves from these cannibals. Well, after that letter, he left for a few months, probably trying to find gold somewhere, because he was obsessed with it, and he thought he could get into heaven with it. Columbus returned to Hispaniola after 4 months, and he found affairs on the island in chaos. The person he gave captaincy and governmentship resigned, and he returned to Spain, and he left the soldiers under his command to roam the countryside, doing what soldiers do best: raping the native women, robbing the villages, and in the words of Ferdinand Columbus, or Fernando, however you want to call him, Hernando, committing 1,000 excesses for which they were mortally hated by the Indians. I'm pretty sure I just read to you about how the monarchs didn't want that, and he was to, met out punishment. Well, while he was gone, some of those slaves, sick of it, finally turned on their oppressors, and 10 Christians were slain in the ambush. Oh shit. This was all Columbus needed to establish a steady supply of slaves. He didn't even need to maintain the fiction that they were cannibals. They could just say, these heathens attacked us, and thusly I have enslaved them. Despite the fact that the Spaniards had justly earned their mortal hatred by the local inhabitants. When Columbus returned, he found out about it, and he led an expedition against the defenseless Indians that was incredibly savage in its slaughter of, remember, the naked islanders, and the wholesale destruction of their villages. The heavily armed Europeans were accompanied by ferocious greyhounds. Some of these greyhounds, Las Casas wrote, in an hour could tear 100 Indians to pieces, because all the people of this island had the custom of going and nude from head to foot, though many were taken alive, and perhaps 500 were sent as slaves to be sold in Castile. They were carried in 4 ships, and they left for Castile on February 24th, 1495. You know how I said that previous moment was important, where he took just a few captives? Well, in a few short years, a few captives turned to 500 to be taken back to Spain and sold. Here's a note from Michele de Cuneo, an Italian compatriot of Columbus. He was a gentleman adventurer, and he left a pretty lively eyewitness account of the trip. He was a passenger on one of the ships of the fleet of the 1495 voyage back to Spain. He related that 1,600 Indian captives, male and female, had been gathered in Isabela, the island capital. 500 or more of the saleable pieces were loaded aboard the ships. The rest were parceled out to the colonists. When the fleet reached the colder European waters, 200 of the wretched captives had died of exposure. Their bodies were thrown into the sea. Columbus's Italian business agent in Seville, Juanoto Berardi, met at the slave market there. He said, "The ships brought back 500 souls of Indians, men and women, all of good age, from 12 to 35. They came thus to this land as they had been born to their own, and with no more embarrassment than if they were wild animals, of which all were sold, and this proved to be very bad, as they all died, being unfitted for this land. The ships they continued to ply between Hispaniola and Spain, their holds crowded with miserable cargoes of human cattle. One of the hazards of the traffic was the unfortunate tendency of many of the Indians to die on the way to the slave markets. That reflected in the higher prices necessary to make a profit out of the survivors. In one particularly stupid and expensive episode, Columbus held a fleet of 5 ships in Santo Domingo for 2.5 weeks beyond sailing time while he negotiated an agreement with a rebel hidalgo, and his name was Franciscan Roldan. While on those ships, were crammed with slaves to the point of suffocation under the hot, tropical sun with the hatches closed, unable to breathe, anguish and the closeness of their quarters they smothered, and a seemingly infinite number of these Indians perished. Their bodies were thrown into the sea downstream. 5 ships full of slaves. All of them dead. Columbus wrote to Roldan to hurry up with his signature on the agreement because I have detained the ships 18 days beyond their schedule and would detain them longer except for the Indians which they carry. We're a heavy burden and we're dying. At this point, just a few years after his discovery, Columbus literally only cares about the profits and, quote, that he thought of the Indians as a heavy burden. Of course, every business has its drawbacks. Columbus could at least congratulate himself that so far the sovereigns had not interfered with this profitable enterprise, despite their kind of high-sounding instructions about treatment to the Indians. They were willing to accept his word that the steady shipment of slaves were cannibals, or prisoners taken in just wars. The resolution of these events were to engulf Columbus in their tragic weight. His letter to the sovereigns proposing exportation and sale of 4,000 slaves went with the fleet of 5 ships that left Santo Domingo on October 18, 1498. In the same fleet were several hundred colonists returning to Spain and 600 enslaved Indians. Each returning colonist said that they had been presented with a slave by Columbus himself as a token of his goodwill. 200 more had been allotted to the masters of the ships to cover the cost of their transportation. With the arrival of the fleet and his letter, it couldn't have come at a worse time for Columbus. At this point, complaints of the chaotic and harsh rule of the 3 Italian brothers. At this point, Diego and Bartholomew were both helping Admiral Columbus rule in the Indies, in the Caribbean. And as the historian Angel Alto Laguare, please forgive me if I butcher these names, he said, "The state of misery which reigned in Hispaniola was demonstrated by the fact that Columbus, for his own profit and to meet the expenses of the colony, found no other means than to sell its inhabitants." Columbus's proposal for wholesale enslavement of the natives to meet the economic needs of the new colony not only confirmed the reports the sovereigns had received from other sources, but also awakened them for the first time to the real character of his traffic in human beings. And with the awakening came a royal explosion. Las Casas wrote, "I don't know what prompted the Queen with so much anger and severity to order those 300 Indians whom the Admiral had given as slaves returned. I found no other reason but that, until this latest arrival, I believe the Queen, because of erroneous information with which the Admiral sent to the sovereigns, supposed they were taken in a just war." That's what Columbus wrote. These were just slaves taken in a just war. These were cannibals. These were heathens. These weren't people. They were naked. They were docile. They were to be used in servitude. Columbus's downfall was harsh and humiliating, and it came within a few weeks of the decree. Summarily, he was removed from his high estates of viceroy and governor of the New World. Eventually, the sovereigns ordered him and his 2 brothers released and authorized the 4th voyage by Columbus. But they mandated that he never set foot on Hispaniola again. Whew. So that's Columbus and slavery. And as I said, I'm going to be touching back on this topic even more in the future. And after this next brain break, we're going to be going over a very important topic, so pay attention. But for the moment, get a drink of water, pay attention to the road, tell a loved one you love them, give them a smooch for me, and we'll be right back. Welcome back from the very depressing slavery that we just talked about. Now let's get into something even more depressing. Genocide. The third part of the second part of the Columbus Chronicles. Which is a way better terminology for this. Maybe I'll change it. Probably not. What is genocide? In the broad sense, it's the deliberate killing of a large group of people. Well, what is genocide defined by the United Nations in Article 2? In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. 1. Killing members of the group. 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So it includes both mental and physical aspects and reflects on the idea of wholesale destruction of specific ethnical, national, racial, or religious groups. We've seen it several times in history. But what I'm about to say, and about to prove to you, is that we had never seen it, and still to this day haven't seen it on such a magnitude as was done through the colonization of the Americas by Europe. Let's talk about the group and who was this original genocide by Columbus? Who were these people? And I've mentioned them briefly. The indigenous group on the island were known as the Taino or Arawak people. They originated from Venezuela, and they traveled to Hispaniola around 1200 CE. It only really been around on that island for 300 years. 1492, which is basically considered the peak of the people. There are 5 different kingdoms on the island, and many distinct languages also existed. There's pretty heated debate on the population of the people on the island around 1492. The best estimates range from 1.1 million all the way up to about 7.5 million. I know it's a pretty big gap, but we can be pretty certain of those estimates. How did those people live? Well, they lived in usually circular buildings. They were made with straw or palm leaves, and they slept in hammocks. The Taino village generally also had a flat court used for games and festivals. They were polytheists, and their gods were called Zemi. Religious worship and dancing were common and probably attractive, as they were all naked, and they ate well, and they exercised. So it was probably some pretty good-looking dancing. We missed out on that. We killed them. Medicine men and priests also consulted the Zemi, or gods, for advice on public ceremonies. For food, they relied on meat and fish. Lots of fish, as there's protein, and small mammals, rats, ducks, turtles, snakes, bats, so on and so forth. They also relied on agriculture. Civilized people. They raised crops. They raised cassava, maize, squash, beans, peppers, peanuts, cotton, and tobacco. which they used in a lot of different aspects of their life, especially tobacco and their social and religious ceremonies. They traveled often, and they used hollowed canoes with paddles. They used them with, they paddled their canoe with puddles. They used for fishing, or they used them for migrations, for moving between the islands. And on the larger canoes, up to 100 people could fit. So pretty dang big canoes. They came into contact with the other tribes of the Caribbean pretty frequently. The Caribs, those cannibals over there, they lived in Puerto Rico and northeast Hispaniola. The Taino people had defended themselves using bone arrows with poison tips and some war clubs. Although it was very rare for them to have them, and if they did have them, they were generally taken from the Caribs people. Almost certainly described that the people, the Taino and the Arawak people, were almost without war. As Columbus said himself, they thought of no evil deed, they didn't commit war, and they were genuinely very cowardly. There's nothing wrong with that. I wish more people were that way. People that would avoid a fight as opposed to running into it. Las Casas says, God, who is a just judge, afflicted and cast him down in this life, he and his brothers of Columbus. I hold it for a certainty that if he had not been impeded by the great adversity to which he came in the end for unjustly and tyrannically making slaves of these people, he would have ended in a very little time in consuming all of the people of this island. But he didn't know. That's exactly what happened, maybe not as fast as Las Casas would have expected. The sovereign's intervention came too late to save the Arawak people. The tragic sequence of events that began on that day of 1492, shortly after the discovery, had played out to the bitter end, so that, with the slaughter from the wars and the hunger and the illnesses that resulted from them, with so much sorrow, anguish, and sadness, there did not remain of the multitudes of people which were in this island from the year 94 to 06, but a third. Great harvest and accomplished in sufficiently short time, he added acidly. Today the Arawak community peoples, those innocents, Father Las Casas wrote, who once inhabited the island in such numbers, they welcomed the white men to the New World. Those people, they vanished. The race perished. In a word from Charles Kendall Adams, president of Cornell University, and may be said to have left only a single word as monument. Spaniards took from them the word hammock and gave it to all the languages of Western Europe. That's pretty poor payment for what the Europeans did. I want to talk about how many people lived in the Americas at the time. Using the best information and methodologies available, evidence seemed to support kind of close to 8 million Taino residents on the island in 1492. The estimate, the number of indigenous peoples who were killed under the governorship of Columbus, we just need to do some simple arithmetic. As I said before, perhaps it isn't all the way up to that 7.7 million, but maybe closer to 1.1. It's regardless of the amount of people, the rapidity in which the destruction of the Taino Arawak people happened is both incredible and sad. If it were 8 million, 7.5 million human beings were subjected to murder, torture, oppression, slavery, and cultural dislocation, all of which exasperated the continual onslaught of the diseases and the warfare-like instruction brought with the European invaders. These people were collateral damage of the economic expansion of the Castilian Empire. 7.5 million human beings were the price paid for the colonial expansion into the newly discovered hemisphere. Every October, here in the United States, those deaths are marked down as a celebration, maybe a day off of work, maybe a parade. The rationale given for the American Indian Holocaust, and that's what it is by many scholars, is that most of the killing was done by germs, not by people. And though this might be numerically true, that more people died directly of disease than did from the sword or gun, can't excuse genocide because of some of the cause was indirect. The reduced physical and emotional resistance to disease due the conditions of slavery, they impart on of the indigenous experience of the genocide of conquest. Put simply, there was no encounter in this hemisphere where the Europeans simply traded with the indigenous people on equal terms without invasion, war, conquest, grand theft of land, labor, cultural dislocation, accompanied by forced conversion to the colonizer's religion. Had that been the nature of the encounter, where perhaps we just simply traded with them, there might have been some legitimate claim to innocence. Everywhere they went, though, the European peoples participated in the violent destruction of the indigenous peoples by both direct killings as well as in the more enduring subjugation, slavery, or conversion to civilization, a process that ensured cultural, political, and economic destruction. By destroying the culture, the colonizers actively destroyed native lives by denying them their usual access to food, traditional medicines, cultural, and religious ceremonies, which directly covers in the current articles of the United Nations what a genocide is. Though the three active agents, disease, war, and cultural destruction, all worked simultaneously to generate a very efficient killing machine. Christopher Columbus, he was directly responsible for instituting the cycle of violence, murder, and slavery that resulted in the denial of adequate food, water, medicine, and ceremonies to the Taino people. It was created intentionally to maximize the extraction of wealth from the islands, in combination with epidemic diseases that were running rampant through the Taino population. Together, those things promoted the genocide of those people. Disease alone would not have caused death on this scale. The people were allowed access to their healthy diet, clean water, traditional medicines. There were certainly deaths from disease. They wouldn't have been on the genocidal scale, especially if they were able to live as separate as they would have normally. Forced to be together, forced to work, forced to toil and kill themselves. Therefore, at best, the theory that disease did the business of killing and not the invaders can only be seen as a gratuitous colonizer apologetic designed to absolve the guilt of the continued occupation and exploitation of the indigenous people of this continent. The truth of the matter is that what we think of Columbus Day, what we think of the history of the colonization of the Americas, should be called by its appropriate name, the American Holocaust. If you don't believe me, here's some data. Nearly 8 million people, 1492. 1496, 3.77 million people. 1500, 500,000. That's 8 years. That's 7.4 million people in 8 years. 1507, 60,000 people. 1514, 22,000. 1531, 600. 1542, 200. 2019, 0. As I said, perhaps the only lasting legacy that the Taino people left, other than their congenial nature, their lightheartedness, their willingness to accept people out of the blue, was the word hammocks. Talk more about the American Holocaust briefly, and I want to talk about the entire Americas, basically on the population decline of native peoples between 1492 and 1900. The best estimate of people living in the Americas was between 75 and 100 million. There are a bunch of different estimates out there, but based on what I saw of the data, this number suggests the most accurate. I personally believe that the number could be higher, but we aren't here for just my personal beliefs. In North America, the United States alone, population decline implies that some 5 million Americans died during the 400 years. But many times the approximate figure of 5 million, so the actual number of 5 million, is the decrease in population. But if we think about it, as new, ever numerically small generations of American Indians were born, lived, and died, more were killed. And that insight is essential for developing a more comprehensive and reliable quantitative assessment for the lives lost in the indigenous Holocaust. So if we have to look at the total amount of lives lost between 1492 and 1900, we basically have to multiply the total number of deaths, the shrinkage of population between 1492 and 1900 by 2.5 to really get an estimate of the decline and death of the indigenous populations during this time. So if we were to take Thornton's estimated hemispheric population decline of 70 million, so let's say we started with 75, we're down to 5 million by 1900. The total number of indigenous deaths throughout the Western Hemisphere between 1492 and 1900 appears to be 175 million people. Any way you look at it, the indigenous Holocaust in the Western Hemisphere was the worst Holocaust the world has ever witnessed. No words or numbers can adequately convey the scale of the horror and tragedy involved in the greatest sustained loss of human life in history. Still, it seems to researchers that understanding the scope and dimensions of the Holocaust is an important first step toward collective political action, which can address the needs, interests, and aspirations of indigenous people today. We want to make sure and ensure that such a Holocaust will never happen again. If you wanted the true story of Columbus, that's it. Now, is it a bit rash for me to lay the lives of 175 million people directly at Columbus's feet? Yes. Would the European powers eventually have colonized and established a presence in the Americas? Probably, eventually. But it was Columbus that was sent, and it was by his edict and his orders that the right of discovery was laid claim to in the New World. It was by his orders that the people were enslaved for the first time in the New World and sent back to the Old. It was by Columbus's orders that they were enslaved on their own land and put to work for Columbus's own profit to find gold and whatever food and cotton that he needed. It was by Columbus's orders to send back thousands upon thousands of slaves, most of which were to die on the ships in the ride to Spanish mainland. So is it a bit much for me to lay the deaths of all of those 175 million people at Columbus's feet? Yeah, it is. Is it that big of a stretch? No. I really don't think so. And I've never experienced anything in writing or reading as sad as what I had to go through and looking this up. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and reflect upon that. All right. We've talked with Columbus, about Columbus, the Columbus Chronicles. We've talked about him. We've talked about murder. We've talked about slavery. We've talked about genocide. Now I want to talk about something else. Syphilis. Do you know what syphilis is? Let's learn from the CDC. How do you get it? Well, you can get syphilis by direct contact with a syphilis sore during vaginal, anal, or oral sex. You can find the sores on or around the penis, vagina, or anus, or in the rectum, on the lips, or in the mouth. Syphilis can spread from an infected mother to her unborn baby. Do you know what it looks like? It's divided into stages: primary, secondary, latent, and tertiary. different signs and symptoms are associated with every stage. What I was just talking about, those sores, that's primary. It's at the origin of the site of infection. These sores usually occur on or around the genitals, on the anus or the rectum, or in and around the mouth. They're usually, but not always, firm, round, and painless. Symptoms of secondary syphilis include skin rash, lymph nodes, and fever. And the signs and symptoms of primary and secondary syphilis can be mild, and they might not be noticed so much. And during the latent stage, that intermediate stage, there really aren't any signs or symptoms. It kind of goes away. Tertiary syphilis is associated with severe medical problems. Primary, secondary, latent, gone. Tertiary, oh God. They usually diagnose tertiary syphilis, need a few tests, and it can affect the heart, the brain, and other organs of the body, not the test, the syphilis. So if I describe to you something that is going on down under, I recommend getting that checked out. Because if you don't get that shit checked out, this is what might happen to you. Enjoy. This is neurosyphilis. Without treatment, syphilis can spread to the brain and the nervous system, or maybe to the eye. This can happen during any of the stages described previously. Some of these symptoms include severe headaches, difficulty coordinating muscle movements, paralysis, numbness, and dementia. That's some shit. So the New Worlders gave the Old Worlders syphilis. I'd say that's karma, except I just talked about the wholesale destruction of 175 million people. Also, syphilis seems pretty nice when you think of the list I'm about to describe, which were either introduced or became cataclysmically worse after Columbus sailed in 1492 in the New World. Smallpox. Oh boy, did this one really fuck up the population, especially with other airborne illnesses like influenza, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, diphtheria, typhus, cholera, scarlet fever, chickenpox, yellow fever, malaria, Lyme disease, Q fever, whooping cough, dengue, anthrax, botulism, tetanus, toxoplasmosis, tyoniasis, tapeworms, syphilis is the only one that the New Worlders really gave the Old Worlders. But syphilis got worse in the New World because of all the raping. So that's nice to know. So I've talked about all of these really horrible things in my first History's Idiots on Columbus, and I think they're important to know and understand that history. But why is it important to research Columbus, and what does it teach us about history and our current society? To me, the first thing is history is a harsh reality. It's harsher than most of us want to admit. When most of us think, or a majority think of history, we tend to romanticize it. Oh, wouldn't it have been great to be alive at... Insert the time here. Second, history is subjective. And though I have tried to point out the facts, others would see Columbus and his expeditions in a different light. That is okay. I understand that from a certain perspective, Columbus could be seen as a conquering hero. That vision does not represent the perspective of all parties involved and is, in my opinion, a sin against history and knowledge. Thirdly, as people with almost all the knowledge of human history at our fingertips, the majority of us are bad making decisions based on reality and logical thought. We live in a world with fake news and people putting their own finances and character above others. Does that sound familiar to you? Fucking should. I just detailed someone that did that pretty extensively. Fourth, I understand the want to believe in a higher power. I will not fault anyone for that opinion. I will fault you if you use that higher power's name in doing crimes against your fellow man, regardless of who or what that power might be. Do not silence the voices around you. We lift them up to be heard. We do not allow misinformation to be spread. We rally against it. One other note that I want to make about Columbus specifically, and I think I made this note on the previous podcast. On this day, today, I will create a petition to abolish Columbus Day. I want it to be henceforth, it shall be known as Reflection Day, a day where we can look back at the subjugated, the soft-spoken, the unjustly murdered, and all of the millions that we enslaved and destroyed in Europe's greed of land, power, and wealth. And that's why I want it to be reflection, because generally, it wasn't us. It wasn't the people alive today that did it. But for most of us, we aren't indigenous to this land, and I want us to recognize the fact that horrible things had to happen for us to live here. So again, I want it to be known October 14th instead of Columbus Day. I want it to be known as Reflection Day. Let us not reflect on the Holocaust only in the United States and North and South America. Let us reflect on the Holocaust in Africa, the Rwandan people. Let us reflect on the Holocaust in Europe, the Jewish people, the Polish people. Let us reflect on the deaths and tyranny of the Soviet Union. Let us reflect on the lives of all of those lost to causes that shouldn't have been, due to the greed of mere people. On history, authors, historians, and history students engage in something called presentism, when they view the past from a modern perspective. Presentism manifests when the outcome is portrayed as inevitable. Significant historical figures and the contemporaries did not confront uncertainty. For an example, if modern students or historians were to assess the American patriots' involvement in the 1773 Boston Tea Party as fail-safe, their presumption would be replete with presentism. It relies on variables and results we know of, and that were unknown to historical figures, and it presumes inevitability. We often think about that in history, these things would have happened. That's presentism. Exceptionalism. That's when we deify specific people in history, like Christopher Columbus. Omission. When we completely disregard other facts that are available in record, things in history become misrepresented. Those manifest in our history books. They manifest in literature and other forms of media. I'm not immune. But I really want you to, as part of this podcast and listeners, to look at history through a multi-perspective lens. And when I look through that lens, there's evidence, primary, contemporary, modern, that indicate Columbus was a fanatic, had fanatic delusions of grandeur. Even in his will, Columbus asserted, I presented Spain the Indies. I presented it because it is evident that by the will of God, our sovereign, I gave them as a thing that was mine. Emphasis added. Him and his crew violated anti-slavery decrees. They were involved in murder, thievery, rape, enslavement, and other dehumanizing acts that led directly or indirectly to the American Holocaust. This is pretty much the last thing I'm going to say on it, but I appreciate you listening. I hope you learned something. If you have questions, contact at historyuncensoredpod.com. As always, my name is Seth Michaels. And if you could do me a favor, if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed previous episodes, rate and review me wherever possible. Better yet, if you think somebody needs to be taught a lesson in history, send them to the podcast. Show them. Show your friends and family, your pets. I don't care. But I really appreciate you guys listening. It means the world to me. As always, history we remember. Find me at Twitter, Seth4Nerds. Have a wonderful night. A speech by Red Cloud. is addressed to the Lakota people on July 4th, 1903, as he anticipated death approaching. My sun is set. My day is done. Darkness is stealing over me. Before I lie down to rise no more, I will speak to my people. Hear me, my friends, for it is not the time for me to tell you a lie. The Great Spirit made us, the Indians, and gave us this land we live in. He gave us the buffalo, the antelope, and the deer for food and clothing. We moved our hunting grounds from the Minnesota to the Platte, and from the Mississippi to the Great Mountains. No one put bounds on us. We were free as the winds, and like the eagle, heard no man's commands. I was born a Lakota, and I shall die a Lakota. Before the white man came to our country, the Lakotas were a free people. They made their own laws and governed themselves as it seemed good to them. The priests and ministers tell us that we lived wickedly when we lived before the white man came among us. Whose fault is this? We lived right, as we were taught it was right. Shall we be punished for this? I am not sure that these people tell me is true. As a child, I was taught the Takuwakan were powerful, could do strange things. This was taught me by the wise men and the shamans. They taught me that I could gain their favor by being kind to my people and brave before my enemies, by telling the truth and living straight, by fighting for my people and their hunting grounds. When the Lakotas believed these things, they were happy and they died satisfied. What more than this can that which the white man offers give us? Taku Shanskan is familiar with my spirit, and when I die, I will go with him. Then I will be with my forefathers. If this is not in the heaven of the white man, I shall be satisfied. We is my father. The Wakan Tanka of the white man has overcome him, but I shall remain true to him. Shadows are long and dark before me. I shall soon lie down to rise no more. While my spirit is with my body, the smoke of my breath shall be towards the sun, for he knows all things and knows that I am still true to him.